walls, mirrors, writing in blood on furniture. All that would go with that.
Okay. All right. And what, if any, risk factor is narcissism for intimate partner violence?
So a patient, before we get into narcissistic personality traits or disorder, the overall, it's categorized under what's called cluster B personality.
Objection, Your Honor, beyond the scope of the question.
He's explaining the narcissism.
Well, I'll sustain the objection if you
Okay.
ask a question.
Can you explain to the jury what's involved with narcissism as it relates to the risk factors of intimate partner violence and
So
what that realm is?
So narcissism patients have, again, poor self-control, okay, rapid mood shifts, okay. As a result, they have an undue sense of admiration. They worship power, they worship control. They have lack of empathy, and people are generally kept around as long as they're useful to them. A large sense of entitlement. Anything else? Need for praise. So that would go under narcissistic personality and IPV.
What, if any, what, if any, traits would be requiring admiration? Would that fit into it?
Yeah, oh yes, requiring admiration, need to be admired, part and parcel of narcissistic personality disorder. Yes.
Would being envious fit within that?
Yes.
Fragile self-esteem?
Yes.
And what, if any, record evidence do you have that correlates with Mr. Depp being narcissistic?
Well, I do think that the fact that he thought that Amber owed him, Ms. Heard owed him.
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Thank you. Go ahead.
The fact that Ms. Heard owed him and only wanted to be together with him because of his fame is an example of that. I do think the jealousy aspects are an example of that. I do think, as I think Mr. Tillett had testified that, being admired is one thing, but then behind your back saying something else about people is another thing. And I can probably say with a reasonable certainty that to some degree this whole trial is that.
Objection, Your Honor.
What's the objection?
That's not record evidence. Speculation.
Overruled.
Please continue.
That this whole trial, in terms of narcissistic insult, is what's going on. I believe that Mr. Depp was very much a mainstay appropriately in Hollywood, and then this was pulled the rug without.
Objection, Your Honor. Can we be?
He's able to explain what
I'll
he's.
sustain that objection.
Can you explain what you mean by this whole trial?
This
Your Honor, can we
proceeding would go.
approach?
Yes.
This court
Yeah,
case
there's-
would go right.
There's an objection, sir.
What other conduct is in the record evidence that correlates with Mr. Depp being narcissistic, having those traits?
Was the thing about the trial rule? I can't
Yeah,
speak.
Your
you're
Honor.
not allowed to say that.
Not say that. Okay.
Okay.
The only other thing about narcissism that I think in terms of the trial would be in order to maintain any sense of control, a narcissistic person really has to have lack of empathy, because in order to engage in behaviors that quote unquote are used to keep individuals in control, you don't really think about the other person. You're not really caring what happens to that other person. So I think that's another facet.
So are attitudes accepting or justifying intimate partner violence a risk factor for intimate partner violence?
Yes.
Do some perpetrators in intimate partner violence try to minimize the IPV?
Yes. So it is unfortunately not uncommon, especially during the calm phases of the abuse cycle where there is no increased tension, there is no acting out. Okay, you are talking about more of the honeymoon, apologetic phase, begging for forgiveness, telling them how you're going to change, maybe giving them gifts. And then when the dust settles later in the day, a day or two later, it is not uncommon for the perpetrator to kind of switch the blame over to the victim, saying that, hey, this either denial, this never actually happened, and trying to make me look bad, or an allopathic defense where you instigated it, or an altruistic effect where I'm doing it for you, transformative effect, that society kind of accepts this. So it is very uncommon for all of a sudden for that to start shifting during that time, because it is during the calm phase and everything is relatively calm. This, of course, is when the victim wants to engage in treatment. But beyond that, the ability to kind of, quote unquote, for lack of a better phrase, win people over, family, friends, the law. I mean, the very ability to do that is part and parcel of that calm, charming phase where it looks like the victim is, just fabricating this.
And is victim blaming a characteristic?
Yes, like I said, to blame the victim, that one of the defenses are the allopathic defense comes along with victim blaming. That's what essentially you're doing. I'm blaming you for what you made me do.
Okay. And is there record evidence that you reviewed that correlates with Mr. Depp engaging in this type of behavior?
So I think for a lot of the issues seen, the big precipitant was going to be the need for sobriety. Coming back to that severe
Objection, Your Honor, non-responsive.
I think he's trying to explain it. Thank you. Please continue.
The severe substance use disorder, and many of their arguments, but what I reviewed in the record, stemmed around Ms. Heard's desire for Mr. Depp to maintain sobriety, and that what was happened. So as a result, she was blamed for, bothering him in a way he didn't want to be bothered, and that triggered what was going on.
Are you familiar with the term gaslighting?
I'm familiar with the term gaslighting.
Okay. What, if any, gaslighting is consistent with intimate partner violence and the risk factors?
So again, when you start being able to be, when a person starts to be able to be manipulative and charming, you start to be able to win people over, and especially when you see someone who's a victim who is essentially vulnerable, emotionally labile, okay? You see that person, and then you see this calm demeanor in front of you who's very charming, very engaging, very personable, and then all of a sudden it starts looking like the victim is just was essentially losing it, and i.e. they're being gaslighted.
Is there examples where an intimate partner violent perpetrator claims that the victim is the person who's actually committing the abuse?
Yeah, oh yes.
How common is that?
That's very common. Again, that is very common in the occurrence of the honeymoon phase and the calm period of the abuse cycle. Very common during that time, where the victim, where they're shifting the blame, or anything along that line, that's very common for that to happen.
And you indicated that you reviewed some audio tapes in this case, correct?
Yes.
And what, if any, evidence did you review there that correlates with Mr. Depp attempting to claim that Amber was the one?
Well, I think that was what was said, that Amber was the abuser.
Objection, Your Honor.
I don't understand the objection.
What record evidence?
Overruled.
Thank you. Please continue.
So that claiming that Amber was the abuser in this particular scenario. And what I will reiterate again is that, one, victims are imperfect, and two, it is not uncommon in the context of being a victim when you know that person is about to proceed or relapsing to a substance or going to a substance and anticipating what's going to happen, that you anticipate the next move and start initiating self-defense. But by and large, that's not what's going on here. By and large, Mr. Depp,
Objection, Your Honor.
behavior was
There's
consistent.
an objection, sir.
Oh, sorry.
I'll sustain the objection.
Okay. All right. We can move on to the next one. Is prior victimhood of abuse a risk factor for intimate partner violence?
Yes.
And
So-
go ahead.
There is something known as intergenerational theory of violence, which is basically along the line of observation, imitation, reinforcement. So you observe a behavior that occurred in childhood, you imitate it when you see that there's no significant negative consequences, but you do get the positive consequence of maintaining control of a situation, solving the conflict in your way, if you would. So that theory is, interestingly, it applies to not only the victims, not only the perpetrators, but also the victims, because there are many victims who grow up in a house of abuse that are not abusers, but they're the victims of abuse.
What are the warning signs of intimate partner violence?
So warning signs would be increasing the tension, escalations of tension. So that's when you start seeing, hey, partner's getting angry, okay, starting to break down the communication, starting to engage in verbal, nonverbal threats. Victim concedes due to this tension, and that leads you to the actual acts. So these acts progressively build, and then they occur.
What, if anything, have you seen in intimate partner violence about apologies and promises?
So again, the apology is part and parcel of the honeymoon phase, and promises are part and parcel of the honeymoon phase. And, the victim wants to believe it's going to work. They want to believe their spouse is going to be faithful to this. And as part of the abuse cycle, it ends up, as I should say, in the calming cycle, like I said, the victim tries to get some help to try to resolve this until the tension buildup phase where something bothers them. So again, it could be bothering someone about substance abuse. It can be bothering someone about finance. It could be bothering something about your career. Anything is liable to build up tension when you have this framework of limited self-control and erratic, intense mood shifts.
So what, if any, record evidence did you review that reflected Mr. Depp engaging in these warning signs, including the apologies and the promises?
I think that was almost routine, that after it was all said and done, that he would apologize for letting this monster out, letting this anger out, almost routinely. And there's very well record evidence of that starting as early on in the marriage, in therapy for Ms. Heard. So that's very common and very much occurred, recognizing what happened. And the other part of this is, again, when you can recognize that when you're sober, even short-lived sobriety, when you could recognize that things are better, things are happening better, life is better, then even that should show you that, hey, there's an issue here. There are issues